Hello, everybody. Up next is our keynote speaker. And before General Petraeus comes on stage, it is my pleasure to invite Brigadier General retired Don Bacon, Congressman from Nebraska, to the podium, a distinguished officer of the United States Air Force and highly decorated aviator. Congressman Bacon specialized in electronic warfare, intelligence, reconnaissance, and public affairs during his long military career. He has served 4 deployments in the Middle East, most notably in 2007 to 2008 in Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom. His military decorations include the Air Force Distinguished Service Medal, 2 Bronze Stars, 2 Legion of Merits, and 5 Meritorious Service Medals. Congressman Bacon will introduce our keynote speaker, General David Petraeus. Congressman Bacon.
Thanks, Ambassador. Hopefully the mic's working. Can you hear me all right? Thank you to the Ambassador for the introduction. It's an honor to be here at the Hudson Institute today. It's really an honor for me to recognize General Petraeus and Ambassador Ross. During my military career, I got to work with both of them in different capacities. General McChrystal has a good quote: "Nothing ruins a good war story than an eyewitness," right? And but in this case, I was an eyewitness to General Petraeus' leadership, and everything that we say about him was so true during my time in Iraq. So I just want to, instead of giving you his full background, I just want to give you a little story of what I saw in Iraq. I got there in 2007 in the spring, about the same time that General Petraeus showed up. It was when our fortunes in Iraq looked at their worst. The mood was bleak. Our casualties were at the highest they had ever been. And there was no optimism of where we were going. And we brought in General Petraeus because he had a vision for how to fix this. So it was my good fortune to come in about the same time and to see the progress that we made in 1 year under his leadership. So when he showed up, we had 120 fatalities a month, U.S. fatalities. The attacks against our forces and against the Iraqi forces and installations and economy were at its highest. And he brought in the surge strategy, and not only a surge of U.S. forces, but a surge of new ideas. So we brought in 30,000 roughly new troops. He put in those forces into our populated areas where we could protect them better. And then he was able to get the Sunni tribes to lead that fight against Al-Qaeda. And at the same time, he had to come up with a strategy to counter the Iranian-trained militias that were wreaking havoc down there too. And he also had to help compel the Iraqi leadership to build a government that had Kurds, Sunnis, and Shia in it, and I got to watch that firsthand. And a year later, our fatalities were often less than a handful of Americans, 120 down to times 2 or 3, and then a year later there were 0 for many months at a time under this doctor. So a couple of just little anecdotes. One time, Prime Minister Maliki criticized the U.S. forces there, and General Petraeus says, "I want Stratefx," that's where I worked, to go and build a briefing, and we're going to go show Prime Minister Maliki the good things that our folks are doing. Well, my boss was gone. That was a colonel. So I ginned up a 10-slide briefing, big boards, and showed how we were building a dam or working the dam, building a hospital. I sent them over to Joe Petraeus' office. They said, "Come with me." So I went with Joe Petraeus to Prime Minister Maliki's house. And I said, "Sir, this is what you said about our forces. Let's remind you of the things that we're doing in Iraq." And we went through the hospital, the dam, the port down south, all the work we were doing there. And what a great opportunity for me to be at the Prime Minister's house with General Petraeus, briefing the Prime Minister. I'll give you another one. General Petraeus made it clear that we want to show the atrocities of Al-Qaeda so people could see what was really going on there. We found a torture house up in the north where people were just brutally murdered. And I wanted to get that story out as a colonel, but my intermediate boss would not let me do it because it was too ugly. But yet I knew that he was saying we need to show what was done. So I did something that was probably not wise. I did it anyway. And I put it out despite my boss, who was a general, and he was coming down to, I was going to hang on the end of I was going to be hanging. But before he came down, General Petraeus sent a note, said, "Great job. That's one of the best things I've seen done." So I got saved, so, thanks to him. But anyway, we owe General Petraeus a debt of gratitude with his many deployments out in the Middle East. Moderating today's discussion is Ambassador Ross. And I got to see him at National War College as one of our guest speakers in 2003 and 4. Here's a person that started out as a Sovietologist, but really he is the foremost expert when it comes to Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He worked to deal with Israel and Jordan. He's worked a lot with the Syrians. Really, there's no one else that has the depth of Middle East diplomacy than Ambassador Ross. So with no further ado, I'd like to invite our two esteemed American patriots up here and to take the stage. Thank you. Ambassador, my pleasure. Thanks.
So, together
Ambassador.
again.
Together again, that's right.
I want to start by asking you a real general comment. One of the interesting things that you noted a long time ago was that the struggle that we face with radical Islamists, and Islam as a religion, Islamism is an ideology. One of the things you noted a long time ago is this is going to be a long struggle. It's not going to be something that's going to disappear overnight. And I'd like you just to sort of offer your perspective on the nature of the challenge, how we ought to think about it, why it's not simply going to disappear quickly.
Well, thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks, Congressman, if you're still in the House, for a very kind introduction. I was delighted to save your bacon by praising your two-star boss for what he would not have approved having you do. We weren't there to lose gracefully, as you recall. And it was take no prisoners time, metaphorically speaking, of course. Thanks to the Hudson Institute for the invitation to be here. Thanks in particular for arranging for me to have the privilege of being on the stage again with one of America's great diplomats and certainly the dean of those who have wrestled with the problems of the Middle East, Dennis Ross. I have enormous respect for the Hudson Institute, done a lot of events with them over the years, and I'm very pleased to be able to be here for this one. I am a bit disappointed, I must say, that the pink ladies were ushered out of the House earlier today. We had a very close relationship during the time that I was privileged to command the surge. Never was there an appearance on Capitol Hill that was not helped by their greeting to me, usually directly behind me with the cameras getting them in the frame. And it would have been a sign of continued relevance if they were still in the room. And so I hold Leon Panetta personally accountable for having them expend all of their energy on him and not saving some for me. This is a great question that you ask, as usual, Dennis, up front, about the duration of the challenge that we face, which, as you know, and we've done this just as little as 2 weeks ago and love doing it together. I've characterized that as a generational struggle. This is not the fight of a decade, much less a few years. And maybe if I could, I'd like to offer 5 lessons up front that I think that we should learn from the fight against Islamist extremists, and to some degree, by the way, against malign Iranian activity. 5 of them. The first is that extremists, Islamist extremists, and in some cases in the Shia parts of the world, malign Iranian elements will exploit ungoverned spaces. It's not a question of if, it's merely a question of when and how significant will that exploitation be. The second is that we have to take action in such situations. And that's because Las Vegas rules, unfortunately, do not apply in these areas. What happens there does not stay there. They tend to spew violence, instability, extremism, and in many cases a tsunami of refugees, not just into neighboring countries and throughout the region, but all the way into the Schengen zone and the countries of our NATO allies and partners, as we saw most significantly with the case of the geopolitical Chernobyl, the meltdown of a country that is Syria, and the consequences of that in Europe being very significant domestic populist pressures that we've seen manifest themselves in a variety of different ways in a variety of different elections and referendum, Brexit arguably being among those. So this is not a problem that we can deal with the way that Washington sometimes deals with it, and that is to admire it until it goes away. Unfortunately, it is not going away. The third is that in taking action, the U.S. invariably has to lead. Now, there may be some cases, such as the admirable case of France leading the way in Mali very courageously and skillfully, but in most significant cases, the U.S. will have to lead. And the reason is quite simple, that we have the assets that are proving to be the most valuable of all as we engage in what might be termed advise, assist, and enabling operations. And that's what we are doing. This is a big deal, as Joe Biden might have observed. This is such a big deal that it is arguably revolutionary, that we are able to defeat the Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria without our young men and women having to be on the front lines more than in select counter-terrorist operations and as advisors. And it's because of the skill of our young men and women in uniform and those of coalition countries, and this should be a coalition, and the coalition should include Islamic countries, and I'll explain that more in a moment. But the assets that we can bring to bear, particularly the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, especially the Predators and Reapers, the unblinking eye up there 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and the advantage that that provides to the forces that we are advising, assisting, and enabling is profound. You could take all of the similar capabilities of other countries around the world and multiply it times 5 or 6, and I think you probably wouldn't get to the number of orbits that we can keep up there. Now, I'm not talking about little drones. I'm not talking about do-it-yourself quadcopters. I'm talking about the coin of the realm, which is the Predators and Reapers, which have such extraordinary optics and other intelligence gathering capabilities, and from which we can shoot something that very few other countries will do off their platforms that are similar. Beyond that, we have the unique ability to do industrial strength intelligence fusion. This is perfected really, or first done during the surge in Iraq when we brought all of our, we had to build a cloud in Baghdad. We couldn't ship all the data back to the States for intelligence analysis because of the size of it. So we built our own cloud. We brought the applications engineers and scientists out from the United States out there. By the way, it's amazing how productive people can be when there's nothing to do but work 24 hours a day. There's nobody asking when they're going to come home for dinner, and they can't drink. Productivity was extraordinary. But so we have that unique ability as well. And then, of course, the precision strike, which many of our allies and partners can also bring to bear, but which we have in industrial strength numbers. So those capabilities are extraordinary, but it should be a coalition. I am a huge believer in having as large a coalition as you can have. I was willing, as the commander of the largest coalition at that time in Afghanistan, to spend whatever it took in coalition maintenance activities, and it should include Muslim countries. If you think about this endeavor right now, this challenge is more of a fight for the heart of the Muslim world. So it's a clash within a civilization more than it is a clash of civilizations, to hearken back to Sam Huntington's book of that name. And many of our successes in this particular fight have come together with Muslim partners and leaders and intelligence officers and special operators of Muslim countries. The fourth is that in leading, we have to ensure that we embark on a comprehensive campaign. This has to be what the congressman was referring to earlier. It's a civil military campaign. It is not just a counter-terrorist endeavor. In fact, the paradox of this enemy is that you cannot counter terrorists like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda with just counter-terrorist force operations. You are not going to drone strike or Delta Force raid your way out of this problem. It takes all of the above. And in fact, we created a slide for Congress during the surge called the Anaconda Strategy slide, just to show that while military force was necessary, absolutely necessary, because without the security foundation, nothing else is possible. It is not sufficient. It takes all the other elements that, again, the congressman was referring to, and he's correct to say that the surge that mattered most was not the surge of forces, it was the surge of ideas, it was a change in strategy, the major elements of which were 180 degrees different over what we were doing before. Instead of consolidating on big bases, you live with the population. Instead of handing off to the Iraqis at an ever-increasing pace, we stopped it and actually took back control until we could reconstitute them. Promote reconciliation with the Sunni Arab community, by the way, also with the Shia Arab community as well. Stop releasing detainees until you have a rehabilitation program, et cetera, all very, very different. So this has to be a comprehensive approach with a large coalition that includes Muslim countries. And then finally, the fifth point, which is really what you got me started down this road on in the first place, Dennis, is that this is a generational struggle. Therefore, we must have a sustained commitment as our strategy. And what is hugely important is that what was begun by the previous administration, give them credit for that, however reluctant they may have been to return to Iraq and to take action in Syria, did get us down this road on which this administration has built now very effectively. And that is to have a strategy that is sustainable in terms of the expenditure of blood and treasure so that we can have the kind of sustained commitment that is necessary in an endeavor that is generational in nature. And so, for example, in Afghanistan, to go to an approach that does not have time-phased or time-based drawdowns, regardless of what conditions are on the ground and so forth, is a very wise approach. So thanks for giving me the excuse to deploy the 5 lessons that we should have learned.
Anytime you want to travel around the country and make those 5 points, I will be your sidekick on this. I'm happy to ask the question and trigger the discussion. And I mean, in all seriousness, I want to do that because what you just laid out was a conceptual approach to what we're facing.
It helps to get the big ideas right.
Well, it's, basically, if you don't get the big ideas right, you're not going to get the smaller ones.
Exactly.
They're not going to be
right.
very relevant.
Yep.
And I want to follow up on some of what you raised. Look, one of the points you made was if there are ungovernable spaces, those are going to be exploited. Another way of saying that is nature abhors a vacuum.
Yep.
And in the Middle East, whenever there are vacuums, the worst possible forces fill it.
Yep.
It's a
and not
reminder.
just the Middle East, North Africa,
Absolutely.
Central Asia.
Absolutely. So one of the principles that I think that has to guide American policy is be very mindful of making sure vacuums don't begin to emerge.
Wherever possible. Couldn't agree with you more. Which is why we need diplomats, frankly. It's why we need to fill the vacancies in the State Department and so forth.
That's part of your comprehensive approach as well, because it can't be only military. It's going to have an economic dimension, a diplomatic dimension. It's going to have an ideological dimension.
Sure. No, it's all of the above. And it's, when we went back for the surge, I remember the president called me in once I'd been confirmed, and this is the final sort of, pat on the back and photo op before you go off and try to turn big ideas into reality on the ground. And I remember he said something along the lines, well, General, we're doubling down here. And I said, Mr. President, your military is going all in, and we need all the rest of government to go all in with us. And he very much worked to make that a reality.
Part of what you also raised was this is not a conflict between civilizations, it's one within a civilization
Yes.
and a culture.
Yep.
For us to succeed, part of this comprehensive strategy has to be not just having Muslim partners, but having Muslim partners who will discredit the ideology, because we can't.
Correct.
It is not up to us to discredit this ideology. It has to come from Muslims. Now,
Far more authentic. And
Absolutely.
so that's why the Emirati initiative to counter violent extremism in cyberspace, to work to chip away at the virtual caliphate. Because, my worry is that we will take away, we now meaning the forces we're supporting in Iraq and in Syria with a coalition, will defeat the Islamic State on the ground, take away the ground caliphate, one of the true distinguishing features of the Islamic State over al-Qaeda, the other being their facility in cyberspace, their ability to operate in that new battlefield domain. But an obvious concern is that we can put a stake through the heart of the ISIS army, maybe even through Baghdadi eventually at some point, their leader, but we're not going to be able to put a stake through the heart of the virtual caliphate. The internet is still going to be active. I think there needs to be much more done by internet service providers and social media platforms. They've got to do this with artificial intelligence because it's beyond the ability of human beings to take the action at the frequency and the amount that is necessary. This was done quite effectively in dealing with child pornography. Some of that's illegal. Maybe it's time for legislation to work with those who control these media platforms to take that kind of action.
You know, one of the things I would like to see, you look at the ISIS ideology, and one of the claims is not just that they created a caliphate, which is now being undone, but also that their warriors are basically ones with a divine mandate.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that we could be doing, apropos of your point on social media, we have now had a significant number of ISIS fighters surrender.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how could you be both someone who has a divine mandate on the one hand and be surrendering with your hands up on the other? If you want to do a lot to discredit the ideology, nothing does it more than A, showing that, but B, then also having some of them come in and tell their stories.
Yep. We'll bring the congressman back on active duty. He had a particular facility for doing this. In truth, we had a whole series of big ideas that guided our actions in Iraq. You heard a few of them, but they went even further. So we had a communications big idea, and it was be first with the truth. We wanted to try to beat the bad guys to the headline. By the way, the bad guys say the Shia militias in Sadr City had CNN's Baghdad bureau speed dialed on their cell phone. And as we are doing the extraction of Special Mission Unit JSOC forces from an operation in there, they're already dialing in saying that we've just been responsible for a new atrocity. We're beating them to the headline and pulling in full motion video to show demonstrably that it's they that shot at us, not us at them, and this kind of thing. But being able to show that, you know, we've talked before about the urgency of this. All the way back when we did this, I don't know, a year and a half ago, we talked about the imperative of accelerating the fight against the Islamic State, because the sooner you can show that they're losers as opposed to winners, is the sooner they're no longer as effective in cyberspace, in that new battlefield domain, and the sooner the virtual caliphate doesn't have the same attraction that it used to have. So that's another, by the way, we also have taken away from there the big media center that they had in Raqqa. There's been great public accounts of how what they had in there, all the screens and everything else that they were using. Very sophisticated operation. So exactly right, showing this, but again, not overdoing it, merely showing the facts. Again, trying to be first with the truth, not with spin. And by the way, sometimes being first with the facts means that you acknowledge that we made a horrible mistake, as happened at some days, or that we just had a really bad day.
Right.
In fact, one of the predecessors of the strategic communications world in which the congressman operated was allowed to return a little before he would have otherwise, because there was a difficulty coming out and saying, we had a horrible day today in Baghdad. 150 innocent Iraqis were killed in 2 different suicide bombings in marketplaces. Here's the facts as we best understand them. Here's the lessons we're taking. Here's what we're going to do with our Iraqi security force partners to mitigate the chances of that happening again. But that's what you've got to do as well. As you know, you can't put lipstick on a pig. It still is ugly, and all you've done is erode your credibility.
So I want to pick up, because you made a reference to the Sadr forces and how you affected them. Today, it's interesting that Sadr may be demonstrating more than anything else that he's an Iraqi nationalist.
Very much so. He's the hope in many respects.
Right.
He's a counterbalance in the Shia political spectrum to these Hashd-e-Shabi, the Shia militias that are largely funded, trained, equipped, supported, and even directed to a considerable degree
by the Quds
force of Iraq, and by Qasem Soleimani personally.
Right. I want to get at this notion of radical Islamists who are Sunni and Shia. It's not just one or the other. They may fight each other, but the fact is they have many similar instincts, attitudes, approaches. What binds them is no respect for borders. What binds them is a complete rejection of the other. What binds them is basically an instinct towards dominance and intolerance. And we can talk about ISIS, we can talk about Al-Qaeda, we can talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, we can talk about the Islamic Republic of Iran, we can talk about Hezbollah, we can talk about many of the popular
Hamas.
mobilization forces, right? So when you look at this array, they don't all represent the same kind of challenge. When you think about the different challenges that they embody or represent, does it call for a more calibrated strategy in your mind, or do you think that one set of principles works for all? I mean, how do you think about that?
Well, I think one of the big ideas here is to acknowledge that we never have enough of what we'd like to have. I mean, there's never been a military commander in history who had enough soldiers, enough money, enough predators, enough bandwidth nowadays.
Right.
So you have to, at the end of the day, prioritize. And to some degree, you're going to be allocating shortages. That's what you are doing. No element is going to get everything that they want, unless it's the absolute number one priority. That might be the case, but that means, of course, that the others are not going to get all that they want. So I do think that's exactly right. And you've got to assess in a fairly, very cold-eyed way what elements are posing the greatest threat to our homeland and to the homelands of our allies and partners, which pose the potential for another 9/11. And I think, you've got to do this in a very, very brutally realistic manner, noting that you do want to take action against some of the others. I mean, look, in the first year in the surge in Iraq, I decided that we had to focus on the Sunni Arab extremists, on Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the associated movements, the so-called Sunni insurgent groups, which were threatening the very survival of Iraq as we knew it, and that what we needed to do was do just what was necessary against the Shia militias, which were very damaging as well. And ideally, we could even get them to take a knee for a while. And that actually happened. It was both serendipity and, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Again, by the way, it was largely a result of the communications effort that we had. The Shia militia were responsible in the first probably 4 months of the surge in Iraq for the assassinations, the deaths, the murder of 3 governors of Shia provinces in southern Iraq, and also 3 police chiefs of Shia provinces. This is also a very, very big deal. And then they were the catalyst for violence in Karbala, the second holiest city in Shia Islam, during a religious holy period for Shia Islam, something that so outraged the prime minister that he personally strapped on a pistol and went with a column of 100 vehicles from Baghdad down to confront them, was personally arresting people down there. And they realized, after we hung the deaths of these 6 governors and police chiefs, and then the violence in Karbala around their neck publicly through, again, first with the truth kinds of approaches, that they needed to lie low for a while. And that was very, very helpful because it reduced quite significantly the violence they were instigating. And it was just at a time when we were starting to drive the violence down against the Sunni insurgents and Al-Qaeda in Iraq as well. And that allowed us to really focus for the entire first year very heavily on the Sunni extremists, and then we would turn to the Shia extremist militia forces. We did it a little bit early. Some of you may recall that there was a bit of an impulsive decision by the Prime Minister of Iraq to clean up Basra on a little bit faster timeline than we had planned, and we had to sprint to support that and to move a lot of assets and reposition and so forth, and very narrowly averted what would have been a disastrous defeat, including with him personally down inside Basra city and encircled, and instead basically destroyed the Shia militia in the ensuing fighting there, then in Sadr city, then in Khatami and a variety of other Shia locations throughout southern Iraq, having largely by that point in time defeated the Sunni extremists as well.
One of the interesting elements I might add to your principles is reflecting what you're also now saying. One critical element of this effort is, how do you publicly frame what you're doing in a way that is compelling.
Yeah.
I want to get into a related issue because the two of us never have a very hard time talking together, and already I realize that we don't have a
I was
lot more
worried
time.
we weren't going to be able to fill up 45
Yeah.
minutes.
So usually we fill up the stage for quite a bit of time, and we're doing it again. But I want to take this concept of framing, and I want to relate it to, if you look at what I call the imbroglio between the Saudis, Emiratis, Bahrainis, Egyptians versus Qatar right now, in many ways it distracts from what we need to do in terms of ensuring that they collectively help in filling the vacuum after ISIS, because if they don't,
Very good point.
Iran will.
Yeah.
And we're already seeing Iran is,
Yep.
we're talking about this, they're acting about it right now.
Iran is great about looking for and finding waves and then riding them.
Right,
They're doing the
exploit.
same thing in northern Iraq right
Right.
now, obviously.
Right.
Where an ill-timed referendum, understand the aspirations, absolutely, but a referendum then that was also conducted in the disputed internal boundary areas as well forced Prime Minister Abadi to have to take action, and they were quick to exploit that, as you saw.
And now they're pushing beyond what were the borders pre.
My understanding is they're
2014.
stopped, but we'll see. Touch
We'll
wood
see,
on that,
especially
please.
because-
Anybody who has wood around them, because we're surrounded by plastic up here. But no, I am concerned about that. yeah.
Both to sort of ensure that they help in terms of the reconstruction that is necessary, even the governance, the security that is necessary, so that there isn't a vacuum there for the Iranians, but also to be part of the broader effort to counter what the Iranians are doing with Shia militia more generally in the region. It's important to end this, what is in fact a distraction. I'd like to see it end in a way that the Qataris also are not completely let off the hook. I've made a suggestion, and I want to get your reactions to it. I made a suggestion that the U.S. should go in and settle this, and the U.S. could do it based on 4 conditions that I believe would satisfy the Saudis and the Emiratis, the Bahrainis and Egyptians, and I think are also reasonable. No one could claim that these are really unreasonable kinds of conditions. And the 4 are that first, the Qataris should fully implement the MOU on countering terrorist financing, which was concluded by them with Secretary Tillerson. Second, that anyone who has been designated by the United States to be on the terrorism list or to be seen as a facilitator, a supporter of terror, should either be arrested by the Qataris if they're in Qatar or expelled by them. Third, any group in the region that we see as contributing to instability, the Qataris will no longer finance. And fourth, that the Qataris would stop their subsidies. They'd phase out their subsidies for Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is many things, but I think one of the things that it has done, it has created a platform that legitimizes the views of those who embody the radical Islamist ideologies. I've said it to you before, you watch oftentimes someone who represents those kinds of extremist attitudes, and they're put on with someone who might have mainstream attitudes, and they're equal. They're treated as if they're the equivalent, which means you legitimize a point of view that should not be legitimized. So these are the kind of conditions I think that would meet our needs on the one hand, should be acceptable to the Saudis, Emiratis, and others, and Qatar should be prepared to accept that. So first I'd like to get your reaction to that.
Well, this is a demonstration of why he's one of the most respected diplomats of his time, and particularly out in that region. Second, let me just note that, look, I had issues with the Qataris. On the one hand, as commander of the U.S. Central Command, they provided $100 million for just the headquarters of Central Command forward. We added another $100 million in IT and all kinds of other systems to that. So this is an extraordinary platform that we had. That's on top of the Combined Air Operations Center we have out there that's been operating the air wars over Iraq, Afghanistan, now Syria, Yemen, and various other places. The airfield complex, which is so vast that, as you know, you could run out of gas just taxiing around the thing on certain days. So it's really quite extraordinary. And then, on the other hand, And I went to the then Prime Minister and to my very, very good friend, General Hamid, now then Minister Hamid, and now Special Advisor Hamid. I'm convinced he in particular was an extraordinary good friend of the United States, but I'd say, so you've done this on the one hand, and then on the other, you're allowing and even subsidizing a TV channel that is being used in part as a platform by extremists or very nefarious political Islamists, not the Ennahda type in Tunisia, which is willing to look to the good of the country rather than to their party, and is quite exemplary in that regard. So we had those issues. I do think we have to be careful not to overdo it. We need to remember that the reason the Taliban are in Doha is because we asked them to be there. Richard Holbrooke, I think rightly said, we've got to have a place where they can be so that we can engage them. This is all done in coordination with the United States. The reception for them, the security and everything else, I think met all of our standards. The same with one or more of the Hamas leaders who, again, are there because Israel and the U.S. asked them to be there. It's not to say all the others and all the rest of this.
That's more the exception than the rule, I have to say.
Yeah, but you've got to be careful not to undermine the arguments or the points, if you will, by those that are not accurate, because there's enough, I think, otherwise. I think the points you made are very reasonable. And I do think, for what it's worth, having, you and I both, I think maybe more than others, are the recipients of lots of communication from either side in this discussion and have been able to ferret out for ourselves, I think, what is fact and what is not quite so factual. Look, I think they're quite intent at this point in living by that MOU, and I wish the United States would declassify it. They have told me, very senior as you can get, that they believe it should be declassified, and they'd like to see the MOU made public, and they have been briefing members of Congress. And so I'm hopeful that we will allow that to take place so that everyone can see it. And then the other items that you have, I think, are, again, very solid, very sound, and very reasonable. I think they're so reasonable, probably all the countries in that region ought to subscribe to the same principles. Because, as you know, there are issues with some of the other countries there, not about countries supporting extremist groups, but about
individuals,
high net worth individuals. Yes. I mean, we dealt with this a lot when I was Central Command and CIA as well. So, again, I think that's a great approach. I think it's both substantively more than adequate, and it's reasonable. It meets the concerns. I think the intent and addresses the legitimate concerns of the countries. And you're absolutely right. Look, we've got to get this past us. They need to come back together. We can't have a splintering of the GCC. And you can't push one or other countries in this direction or that direction. And I hope that this kind of thinking and spirit and so forth can be manifested in action.
I really do think if this was the American position that was presented to both sides and said, this is the way we're going to resolve this, this addresses everybody's legitimate concerns and meets what is something that we really feel has to be dealt with.
Yep. That and a few phone calls from the right person.
A few phone calls from the right person, and with an understanding that these are the conditions that actually we're not going to negotiate because they represent what are a set of things that relate to what is actually threatening us and them.
And I think that is reasonable. And then we see where we go from there.
Right. Well, I've been told I have 1 minute.
A diplomatic summing up is in order.
And what happens after 1 minute is there's a trap door here. The two of us disappear. Let me just sort of conclude, I guess, by saying I realize that 1 minute means 1 minute for both of us, so I've already taken up 30 seconds.
It can be an exception.
Right. When you look at what's going on in Kirkuk right now,
yes,
how concerned are you?
I'm quite concerned, again, because different elements are exploiting this for their own purposes, because it is causing a bit of a break between the Kurdish regional government partners, between the PUK and the KDP in particular. Because it could go farther, and I'm, again, hopeful that this is halted. Again,
you hope it is.
And, you know, talk to Brett McGurk, the president's
Yeah.
envoy, Doug Silliman, the ambassador. I think those are two superb individuals. They're in a tough place because these are all our friends. Not all,
right.
but the Kurds are our friends, and the Iraqis, Prime Minister Abadi, these are our friends. We want inclusive governance to succeed in Iraq, but there are elements up there and engaged in this, as we mentioned earlier, that are not fans of inclusive governance and that want to Lebanonize Iraq,
Right.
just like they'd like to Lebanonize Syria. In other words, to use militias, essentially, controlled by Iran, by the Quds Force, in those countries in the same way that they've used Hezbollah in Lebanon, so that it doesn't just have a paramilitary aspect to it, but it has a political aspect. In the case of Lebanon, obviously, it literally has a veto-proof
That's right.
Element in the parliament if they can keep that together. So that is my concern, yes.
So the trapdoor is not opening up. I want to thank Dave Petraeus,
I thank
first of all, for
Dennis Ross.
his service, but also what is really his strategic perspective on the region. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you all.